On death row in California sits a man who has spent more than 2 decades filing appeal after appeal, hoping that one day a court will overturn the sentence that condemned him. He has argued that he suffered childhood trauma. He has claimed his legal rights were violated. He has insisted that his punishment should be reduced. But every court has reached the same conclusion. The evidence was overwhelming. The murders were deliberate. The cruelty was unimaginable. Because on one summer night in Southern California, an entire Vietnamese American family was nearly wiped off the face of the earth. 5 innocent people were murdered inside their own home. The youngest child, just 3 years old, survived by what many investigators later described as a miracle. When police arrived, they found him wandering through the house, covered in blood, crying for his mother. That heartbreaking image would become one of the most unforgettable crime scenes in California history. This is the story of the Henry Nguyen family massacre. It is a story about greed, betrayal, gang violence, and one of the deadliest robbery crews operating on the West Coast during the mid-1990s. But perhaps the most shocking part is this. The killers were not strangers from another country. One of the people responsible knew exactly who the victims were. She helped lead the murderers straight to the front door. Tonight we follow every step of the investigation that exposed one of America's most ruthless criminal gangs and brought its leader to death row. This is CASEVAULT, and this is the massacre that forever changed the Vietnamese American community. August 10th, 1995, San Bernardino, California. It was supposed to be another quiet summer morning. Instead, it became one of the darkest days the city had ever experienced. Earlier that morning, Henry Nguyen's sister became increasingly worried. She had tried calling her brother several times. No answer. That was unusual. Henry was known for returning calls quickly, especially when family was involved. She dialed once again. This time someone answered, but it wasn't Henry. On the other end of the phone was a tiny voice. The child was crying so hard that he could barely speak. Through tears, the little boy whispered words that would haunt investigators for years. "My mommy is dead." The caller was 3-year-old Dennis Nguyen. His aunt froze. At first, she could hardly believe what she was hearing. She desperately tried asking questions. Was anyone else there? Where was Daddy? Could he unlock the door? But the little boy could do nothing except cry. Terrified, she immediately contacted neighbors and begged them to check the house. Within minutes, a nearby resident hurried across the street. The neighborhood itself appeared perfectly normal. No broken windows. No obvious signs of violence. Nothing suggested that unimaginable horror waited inside. The neighbor knocked repeatedly. Silence. She called Henry's name. Nothing. Only the faint sound of a child crying somewhere inside. Realizing something was terribly wrong, she forced her way into the home. The moment she stepped inside, she wished she hadn't. Blood covered the floors. Furniture had been overturned. The air was eerily quiet. Then she saw Dennis. The toddler stumbled toward her. His tiny body was stained with blood. His hand had been wounded. He reached for help before collapsing beside his mother's lifeless body. The neighbor grabbed the child and rushed outside. Someone else called 911. Within minutes, police officers, firefighters, and paramedics flooded the neighborhood. What they discovered shocked even veteran homicide detectives. Inside the living room lay Henry Nguyen, 44 years old, a hardworking immigrant, business owner, father of 4. He had been shot multiple times. Nearby lay his wife, Yen Trin Nguyen. She too had suffered multiple gunshot wounds. But investigators immediately noticed something deeply disturbing. A white substance had been smeared across her face, around her mouth, her nose, her eyes. Lying nearby was a partially squeezed tube of toothpaste. At first, detectives had no idea what they were looking at. The bizarre detail made absolutely no sense. As investigators continued searching the house, they made an even more horrifying discovery. 3 of the Nguyen children had also been murdered. 15-year-old Doan, 11-year-old Daniel, 10-year-old David. Each had been shot. Each had died inside the family home. Only little Dennis remained alive. Miraculously, the bullet that struck his hand had missed every major artery. Doctors would later say that inches had separated him from death. The entire house looked like a battlefield. Blood stained the walls. Shell casings were scattered throughout multiple rooms. Furniture drawers had been pulled open. Closets had been searched. Cabinets emptied. Whoever committed the murders had spent time looking for something. Money, jewelry, anything valuable. This wasn't a random act of violence. It appeared to be a robbery, but detectives quickly realized something else. There were no signs of forced entry. The front door hadn't been kicked in. The locks were intact. Windows were untouched. That meant one thing. The victims had willingly opened the door. They had trusted whoever was standing outside. Crime scene technicians began documenting every inch of the house. They collected 14 spent 9mm shell casings manufactured by Winchester. Another casing came from a different manufacturer. That immediately caught investigators' attention. Could more than one gun have been used? Later ballistic examinations suggested exactly that. At least 2 firearms had likely been fired inside the home. Footwear impressions offered another clue. Several different shoe sizes appeared throughout the residence. Again, evidence pointed toward multiple offenders. Detectives also recovered a discarded rubber glove behind the house. Curiously, almost no unidentified fingerprints could be found inside. The conclusion seemed obvious. The killers had worn gloves during the attack. They had come prepared. This wasn't a burglary that suddenly turned violent. This looked carefully planned. The autopsies revealed even more disturbing details. Henry Nguyen had been shot at extremely close range. 1 bullet entered his chest. Another struck his head. He also had several shallow knife wounds on the back of his neck. Those injuries suggested he may have been threatened before he was executed. Yen Nguyen's injuries told an equally horrifying story. She had first been shot in the leg, then shot twice in the head. The medical examiner believed she was still alive after the first gunshot. The white substance covering her face became one of the strangest mysteries of the investigation. Initially, detectives wondered whether it might be poison or some unknown chemical. Laboratory testing quickly disproved those theories. It was ordinary toothpaste. Why would killers smear toothpaste across a victim's face? The answer wouldn't emerge until much later. And when it did, even experienced detectives found it chilling. Outside the home, neighbors struggled to understand what had happened. Everyone described the Nguyen family the same way. Kind, quiet, hardworking. Henry had immigrated to the United States years earlier and built a successful landscaping business from the ground up. He worked long hours to provide for his family. His wife earned extra income sewing uniforms for local Vietnamese restaurants while raising their 4 children. Friends described the family as deeply devoted to one another. The children were respectful. The parents stayed out of trouble. There were no known enemies, no ongoing disputes, no public conflicts. Nothing that could explain why someone would murder 5 people. Yet detectives soon uncovered one fact that immediately stood out. Because of the nature of Henry's business, he often dealt in cash. Like many immigrant-owned businesses during the 1990s, a significant amount of money was sometimes kept inside the home before being deposited. Word of that fact may have spread farther than anyone realized. Investigators now faced a difficult question. Was this simply a robbery gone horribly wrong? Or had someone specifically targeted the Nguyen family because they believed large amounts of cash were hidden inside the house? The brutality of the murders suggested something more than panic. The killers had systematically eliminated nearly every witness. Even the children had not been spared. That level of violence pointed toward experienced criminals, not desperate amateurs. As homicide detectives interviewed neighbors, a timeline slowly began to take shape. Several residents remembered hearing loud popping sounds around 10:30 the previous evening. Some dismissed the noises as fireworks. Others weren't so sure. One witness reported seeing headlights speeding away shortly afterward. No one managed to record a license plate. No one recognized the vehicle. But together, the statements narrowed the estimated time of the murders. Meanwhile, little Dennis remained hospitalized. Despite his injuries, doctors believed he would recover physically. Emotionally, however, the damage was immeasurable. When investigators eventually spoke with him, the toddler described something terrifying. He remembered hearing someone knock at the door. His father answered. 3 men suddenly rushed inside carrying guns. They shouted for everyone to lie on the floor. The men were not wearing masks. That single detail stunned investigators. Experienced robbers almost always concealed their identities. Why hadn't these men? Did they believe every witness would be dead before they left? Or did they simply not care? Those questions would soon become central to the investigation. Because what detectives didn't yet realize was that this massacre was not an isolated crime. Hundreds of miles away, other murders shared disturbing similarities. Vietnamese families, home invasions, 9mm handguns, entire households targeted. The San Bernardino massacre was about to become part of something far larger. A violent criminal network was moving across the West Coast, and the FBI was already beginning to connect the dots. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the walls of the Nguyen family home. Within hours, detectives from the San Bernardino Police Department realized they were dealing with something far more sophisticated than a typical home invasion. The killers had moved with discipline. They had worn gloves. They had searched the house methodically. They had executed nearly every witness before disappearing without leaving behind obvious forensic evidence. Whoever they were, they had done this before. The case was immediately assigned to veteran homicide investigators, while crime scene specialists continued processing every piece of physical evidence. every shell casing, every footprint, every blood stain, every fiber, every possible clue. The detectives knew they would probably only get one chance to identify the people responsible. If the killers were professionals, they wouldn't make many mistakes. At first glance, robbery appeared to be the obvious motive. The house had clearly been searched. Drawers had been emptied. Closets had been opened. Jewelry appeared to be missing. Cash was gone. Yet something about the crime scene didn't fit. Professional robbers usually wanted money. These men seemed determined to eliminate every single witness. That level of violence suggested something much darker. Investigators began asking themselves a difficult question. Were the murders committed to cover up the robbery? Or had murder always been part of the plan? Ballistics experts completed their first examination of the shell casings recovered from the house. Most of the 14 9mm casings had been fired from the same Glock 17 pistol. However, another casing had been fired from a completely different firearm. That discovery supported the growing theory that at least 2 armed suspects had entered the home. Footwear impressions pointed in the same direction. Several different shoe patterns appeared throughout the residence. The attackers had moved from room to room together. One searched, another stood guard, another carried out the executions. Everything suggested a coordinated team. The discarded rubber glove found behind the house became another important piece of evidence. It reinforced investigators' belief that the attackers had carefully planned the crime. Almost no usable fingerprints had been left behind. For experienced detectives, that was rarely an accident. Then came one of the strangest discoveries of the investigation. The toothpaste. Detectives simply could not understand why ordinary toothpaste had been smeared across Dennis Nguyen's face. Forensic testing ruled out poison. It wasn't acid. It wasn't a chemical weapon. It was exactly what it appeared to be. Toothpaste. For days, investigators had no explanation. Eventually, experienced detectives proposed a disturbing theory. Perhaps the killers had told Yen the substance was poison. If she believed she had already been poisoned, fear alone might convince her to reveal where the family kept hidden cash or valuables. It was psychological torture, not physical torture. The toothpaste itself caused no harm, but the deception may have been intended to terrify her into cooperating. The theory fit the evidence. The house had clearly been searched. The victims had likely been questioned. Yet despite everything, investigators believed the killers found far less money than they expected. Instead of discovering tens of thousands of dollars, they appeared to have recovered only a relatively small amount of cash and some jewelry. If that was true, frustration may have fueled the extreme violence that followed. As detectives interviewed relatives, neighbors, and friends, a portrait of the Nguyen family emerged. Henry Nguyen had built a respectable landscaping business after immigrating to the United States. Like many immigrant entrepreneurs during the 1990s, he frequently handled cash payments. His wife Yen helped support the family by sewing uniforms for Vietnamese-owned restaurants. Their children were doing well in school. Neighbors consistently described them as friendly, hardworking, and deeply involved with family life. No one could identify a serious personal enemy. No recent disputes. No dangerous business rivals. No threats. Nothing suggested they had been specifically targeted because of a personal grudge. Instead, detectives became increasingly convinced that someone had selected the family because they believed large amounts of cash were stored inside the home. But who knew that information? That question would become critical. While San Bernardino detectives continued working around the clock, another agency began paying close attention: the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Only weeks earlier, investigators in Northern California had been examining another horrifying crime involving a Vietnamese family. In Sacramento, armed intruders had broken into a home. A 73-year-old grandfather had been murdered. His 47-year-old son had also been killed. Again, the victims were Vietnamese. Again, firearms had been used. Again, robbery appeared to be the motive. Then investigators learned about another violent home invasion in Washington state. A Vietnamese couple had been held at gunpoint inside their own house. The attackers demanded cash. They threatened to kill the family's children if more money wasn't produced. The similarities were becoming impossible to ignore. Different cities, different victims, but remarkably similar methods. Vietnamese families, home invasions, cash robberies, multiple armed offenders, 9mm firearms, extreme violence against witnesses. FBI analysts began comparing evidence from every case: shell casings, ballistics, crime scene reports, witness statements, travel patterns, gang intelligence. Slowly, the pieces started fitting together. Instead of several unrelated robberies, investigators now suspected a single mobile robbery crew operating across multiple states. That realization changed everything. The search was no longer limited to San Bernardino. It became a regional manhunt. Then investigators received the first real break. Family members told detectives that Dennis Nguyen always wore a valuable jade pendant. It had enormous sentimental value. She almost never removed it, yet it had completely disappeared after the murders. Detectives immediately circulated descriptions of the necklace to pawn shops, jewelry dealers, and secondhand stores throughout California and neighboring states. They hoped someone would eventually try to sell it. Days passed. Nothing. Then, hundreds of miles away in Seattle, Washington, a phone call changed the investigation. A local man contacted police after seeing media reports describing the missing necklace. He believed he had it. According to his statement, an acquaintance had recently left the jade pendant with him as collateral for a small loan after claiming he needed money for gasoline. The man identified the person who left the necklace, Run Peter Chun. For detectives in California, the name meant almost nothing. At first, within hours, background checks painted a terrifying picture. Run Peter Chun was a 22-year-old Cambodian-American gang member. He was associated with the Tiny Rascal Gang, known on the streets for armed robberies, known for violence, known to investigators across Southern California. Although he had previously been suspected in serious crimes, prosecutors had never managed to build a case strong enough to convict him. Now his name had surfaced alongside property stolen from a murdered family. It was the strongest lead detectives had received since the investigation began. Investigators immediately began examining Chun's associates. One name quickly stood out: Samreth Pan, another documented member of the same gang. Detectives also learned that a silver Honda Accord connected to Pan's family had recently traveled between Southern California, Sacramento, and Washington State. That vehicle suddenly became extremely important. Police obtained a search warrant. Inside the car, investigators recovered unfired 9mm ammunition. The ammunition matched the same caliber used in several murder scenes. Although the rounds themselves could not prove who fired the fatal shots, they reinforced investigators' belief that the vehicle had been involved in the gang's violent crime spree. At this point, law enforcement agencies across multiple states began working together. San Bernardino Police, Sacramento detectives, the FBI, Washington investigators. Information flowed constantly. Telephone records, vehicle sightings, gang intelligence, witness interviews. The robbery crew was finally taking shape. But detectives still lacked one crucial piece of evidence: someone who could place the suspects inside the Nguyen home. Without that testimony, obtaining murder convictions would be far more difficult. Fortunately for investigators, someone connected to the conspiracy was about to make a decision that would destroy the entire gang. A young woman named Nguyen Tran. She had remained quiet during the early stages of the investigation, but mounting evidence was closing in from every direction. Investigators believed she knew far more than she admitted, and before long, they would confront her with evidence she could no longer explain away. What happened next would completely transform the case, because Nguyen wasn't just another witness. She was the insider who had opened the door to one of the deadliest home invasion massacres in California history. For nearly 2 weeks, investigators had worked almost nonstop. The evidence was beginning to point in one direction: Run Peter Chun, Samreth Ban, several known members of the Tiny Rascal Gang. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Detectives still needed someone who could explain exactly how the Nguyen family had been selected. Why this house? Why this family? And who had told the killers that cash was supposedly hidden inside? The answer came from someone investigators least expected: a 20-year-old woman named Nguyen Tran. She wasn't known as a violent gang member. She wasn't suspected of pulling the trigger. But according to detectives, she played a critical role that made the massacre possible. As investigators confronted her with the growing mountain of evidence, her story slowly began to change. Eventually, she admitted she knew the people responsible. Then she admitted something even more devastating. She had told them about the Nguyen family. According to investigators, Nguyen personally knew the victims through the local Vietnamese community. She knew Henry Nguyen owned a successful landscaping business. She knew cash was sometimes kept inside the home. Whether the amount had been exaggerated or misunderstood, the gang believed the family was hiding a fortune. To them, the Nguyens weren't people. They were a target. Nguyen eventually described how the robbery had been planned. The gang needed someone the family would trust, someone whose face wouldn't immediately raise suspicion. That person was Nguyen. According to investigators, the plan was simple. She would knock on the front door late at night. When Henry opened the door, the armed men would rush inside before anyone had time to react. It was a plan designed to remove the biggest obstacle faced by most home invaders: locked doors, security, suspicion. Instead, the victims would unknowingly invite danger into their own home. If the investigators' reconstruction was correct, that is exactly what happened. On the evening of August 9th, 1995, several members of the robbery crew gathered before driving toward the Nguyen residence. Run Peter Chun was allegedly carrying Glock pistols, extra ammunition, a large knife, and rubber gloves. His associates came prepared as well. The operation had been discussed beforehand. Everyone understood their role. Some would control the victims. Others would search for money. Another would watch for neighbors. This wasn't an impulsive robbery. It was organized. According to later testimony, Samrath Pan participated in planning the operation, although evidence presented at trial placed him differently from those who actually entered the house. Other members of the crew would eventually admit that Chun was giving the orders. He was the leader. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, the gang arrived outside the Nguyen home. Inside, the family was preparing for bed. The children had no reason to fear that anything unusual was about to happen. Then came the knock. Henry walked toward the front door. Standing outside was someone he recognized. Nhung. Believing a familiar face had come to visit, Henry unlocked the door. The moment it opened, armed men exploded into the house. Guns were pointed directly at Henry. Everyone was ordered onto the floor. The family obeyed. Parents, teenagers, children, even 3-year-old Dennis. No one resisted. The attackers immediately demanded money. Where was the cash? Where were the valuables? Where was the safe? Henry reportedly handed over what cash was available. But it wasn't enough. The gang had expected far more. Instead of finding tens of thousands of dollars, they discovered only a relatively modest amount of cash and some jewelry. According to later testimony, frustration quickly turned into rage. The robbers became convinced the family was hiding additional money. They refused to believe they had risked everything for so little. That was when the psychological abuse began. Investigators later concluded that toothpaste was smeared across Yen Nguyen's face while she was told it was poison. If she didn't reveal the hidden money, she would die. Terrified, she insisted there wasn't any more. The toothpaste wasn't poison, but she had no way of knowing that. The deception was intended to break her mentally. It didn't work because there was nothing else to reveal. At some point, the robbery crossed a line from theft to execution. According to testimony presented in court, Run Peter Chun shot Henry Nguyen. Moments later, more gunfire erupted throughout the house. The attackers moved from room to room. Children who had done nothing wrong became targets. Witnesses became liabilities. Every living person inside the house represented someone who might later identify the killers. The gang made a horrifying decision: leave no witnesses. David was shot. Daniel was shot. Doan was shot. Yen was shot. The sound of gunfire echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Some neighbors later recalled hearing what they thought were fireworks. No one realized an entire family was being murdered. Only one child survived, 3-year-old Dennis. A bullet tore through his hand. For reasons investigators could never fully explain, he wasn't killed. Perhaps the shooters believed he had already died. Perhaps they overlooked him in the chaos. Perhaps they simply wanted to escape as quickly as possible. Whatever the reason, that single survivor would later provide investigators with crucial information. He remembered hearing the knock. He remembered 3 men entering the house. He remembered guns. For detectives, even those simple memories became valuable pieces of the puzzle. Before leaving, the killers collected jewelry, including Yen Nguyen's jade pendant. They also took rings, earrings, and other valuables. Then they disappeared into the night. According to testimony later presented in court, the gang regrouped after the murders. Instead of showing fear or remorse, they allegedly divided the stolen property before going out together to eat and drink. The contrast was chilling. Only hours after murdering 5 innocent people, they behaved as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Meanwhile, police officers were still trying to identify the dead. As investigators dug deeper into Run Peter Chun's background, they discovered a life shaped by extraordinary violence long before he became a killer himself. He had been born in Cambodia during one of the darkest periods in the country's history. As a young child, he lived through the terror of the Khmer Rouge era. Like many survivors, his family eventually fled Southeast Asia and immigrated to the United States in search of safety. But a new country did not erase old trauma. Former teachers described him as withdrawn. Friends recalled someone who often struggled with anger. As a teenager, he dropped out of school. Instead of building a future, he found identity inside one of Southern California's most violent Asian American street gangs. The Tiny Rascal Gang had originally formed among refugee communities, but eventually became involved in armed robberies, drug trafficking, assaults, and murders across several states. Within that world, violence earned respect. Fear created power. According to prosecutors, Chun embraced both. By his early 20s, investigators believed he had become one of the gang's most dangerous leaders. As detectives continued comparing unsolved cases across California and Washington, an alarming pattern emerged. The Nguyen murders were not the beginning, nor were they the end. Authorities linked the gang to multiple armed robberies and homicides involving Asian American families. Victims were selected because criminals believed immigrant households often kept significant amounts of cash inside their homes. Many owned small businesses. Many worked long hours. Some distrusted banks or handled cash regularly. Those assumptions, whether accurate or not, made them attractive targets for violent robbery crews. The Nguyen family had become one more name on that list. But this time, the investigation wasn't falling apart. This time, detectives had names. They had physical evidence. They had stolen property. And now they had cooperating witnesses. The manhunt was entering its final stage. Within days, law enforcement officers across multiple jurisdictions would move in. Several members of the gang were about to discover that their violent crime spree had come to an end. As investigators pieced together the evidence, the search for the killers accelerated. Every agency involved understood one thing. The gang had already committed multiple violent crimes. If they remained free, more families could die. The FBI joined forces with local detectives, sharing intelligence gathered from California and Washington state. Their goal was simple: find the gang before they disappeared. Fortunately for investigators, the suspects made several critical mistakes. The most damaging was keeping stolen property. The jade pendant taken from Dennis Nguyen became the thread that tied the entire investigation together. Combined with witness statements, ballistics, vehicle evidence, and gang intelligence, detectives believed they finally had enough to act. On August 20th, 1995, law enforcement officers located Run Peter Chun, Vinh Tran, and William Evans at a highway rest stop near Sacramento. The arrest happened quickly. The suspects had little time to react. Officers moved in from multiple directions, surrounding the vehicle before anyone could escape. Inside the car, investigators recovered additional evidence linking the group to the murders. Among the items found was ammunition, consistent with the weapons used during the robbery spree. Other stolen property connected the suspects to crimes committed across California. Almost simultaneously, investigators arrested Samrath Pan and Hung Tran in Southern California. Within just a few days, the core members of the robbery crew were in custody. For the first time since the massacre, detectives believed the Nguyen family would finally receive justice. The interrogations began immediately. At first, nearly every suspect denied involvement. Some blamed each other. Others claimed they had only been present after the crimes. Several insisted they knew nothing at all. But detectives had spent weeks building their case. Every interview was compared against physical evidence. Every statement was tested. Every contradiction was documented. Gradually, the stories began falling apart. Facing overwhelming evidence, some members of the group chose to cooperate. Their testimony helped investigators reconstruct the events inside the Nguyen home with remarkable detail. According to prosecutors, Run Peter Chun had been the leader. He selected the targets. He organized the robbery crew. He directed the operation. Witnesses described him as the person giving orders before, during, and after the murders. Other gang members admitted participating in the robbery, while identifying Chun as the primary shooter responsible for much of the killing. Their statements matched forensic evidence collected at the crime scene. The prosecution now had exactly what it needed. The criminal case that followed became one of the largest murder prosecutions in San Bernardino County. The defendants faced multiple charges, including first-degree murder, armed robbery, burglary, and special circumstances involving multiple homicide victims, because several children had been murdered during the commission of a robbery. Prosecutors sought the death penalty against the principal defendants. Not everyone chose to fight the charges. Vinh Tran eventually accepted a plea agreement. By pleading guilty, he avoided a possible death sentence and instead received life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after serving decades in prison. William Evans also entered a plea agreement. Because he had been a juvenile at the time of the murders, he received a life sentence rather than execution. Hung Tran also accepted a plea agreement after cooperating with investigators. Although she had not entered the house during the murders, prosecutors argued that without her assistance, the robbery might never have happened. She received a lengthy prison sentence for her role in the conspiracy. These plea agreements allowed prosecutors to focus their full attention on the two men they believed bore the greatest responsibility: Run Peter Chun, Samrath Pan. The trial attracted widespread attention throughout California. Members of the Vietnamese American community attended proceedings almost every day. Many had known the Nguyen family personally. Others came because they feared similar attacks could happen again. For immigrant families across the West Coast, the murders shattered a sense of security. The courtroom became emotional as photographs of the victims were shown to the jury. Jurors listened to testimony describing the final moments of Henry and Yen Nguyen. Crime scene investigators explained the ballistic evidence. Medical examiners described the injuries suffered by each victim. The prosecution carefully presented the timeline established through physical evidence and witness testimony, the toothpaste, the shell casings, the jade pendant, the eyewitness statements, the gang connections. Each piece strengthened the overall case. The defense attempted to challenge portions of the testimony and question the credibility of cooperating witnesses. But prosecutors argued that the physical evidence independently confirmed the essential facts. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached its decision. Run Peter Chun was found guilty on multiple counts of first-degree murder, robbery, and burglary. During the penalty phase, jurors considered whether he deserved life imprisonment or death. They ultimately chose death. The verdict reflected not only the number of victims, but also the calculated nature of the crime. The murders had been committed during a planned robbery. Children had been deliberately killed. The jury concluded that the aggravating factors outweighed any mitigating evidence presented by the defense. Samrath Pan was later convicted in connection with additional murders and robberies committed during the gang's crime spree. He also received a death sentence in California. One question continued to follow the case for years. How could someone become capable of such extraordinary violence? Mental health experts examined Run Peter Chun during later legal proceedings. They acknowledged the severe trauma he experienced as a child while living through the Khmer Rouge era in Cambodia. Those experiences undoubtedly left lasting psychological scars. However, experts also concluded that he understood the difference between right and wrong. He was capable of planning crimes. He recruited accomplices. He attempted to avoid detection. Those findings became important during his appeals. The courts repeatedly ruled that his traumatic childhood did not excuse or legally justify the murders. For more than 2 decades, Chun continued filing appeal after appeal. His attorneys challenged procedural issues, jury instructions, and various aspects of the trial. Each time, reviewing courts rejected his arguments. The convictions remained intact. Although California currently maintains a moratorium on executions, the death sentences imposed by the courts remain in place. Like hundreds of other condemned inmates, Chun continues to live on death row, while the legal process continues. For the surviving members of the Nguyen family, however, the legal outcome could never erase the loss. A husband, a wife, 3 children, an entire future stolen in a matter of minutes. Only little Dennis survived. The child whose frightened voice answered the telephone that morning grew up carrying memories that no one should ever have to live with. His survival became the final piece of hope in a story otherwise defined by unimaginable tragedy. The massacre of the Nguyen family changed law enforcement investigations involving organized home invasion robberies across the West Coast. Police agencies increased information sharing. The FBI expanded cooperation between jurisdictions. Investigators paid closer attention to patterns involving traveling robbery crews that targeted immigrant communities. The case also served as a painful reminder of how criminals often prey on hardworking families they believe are vulnerable. Sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers. It comes from someone who already knows your name, someone you trust enough to open the front door. More than 30 years have passed since that August night. The house where the murders occurred is quiet once again. The headlines have faded. Many people have forgotten the names of the victims. But for those who loved Henry Nguyen, Yen Nguyen, Doan, Daniel, and David, time has never erased what happened. Their story remains one of the most heartbreaking examples of how greed, violence, and betrayal can destroy an entire family in only a few minutes. And although the men responsible spent years trying to escape justice, the evidence never stopped speaking. In the end, it wasn't fear that survived that night. It was the truth.